The church bell rang with a heavy, deliberate toll that cut through the suffocating heat of the Texas summer like a blade through flesh. It was not the familiar call to Sunday service, nor the joyous peal of a wedding celebration. This was the sound that summoned the town of Millbrook to witness judgment, a sound that made children clutch their mothers' skirts and grown men pause in their work to cross themselves. Mary Beth Calloway stood bound to the stone post in the center of the town square, her wrists raw from the coarse rope that held her fast. The post had served many purposes over the years, a hitching rail for horses, a mounting block for the cattle auctions. And now, on this sweltering day in August of 1886, it had become her pillory. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her face, and her gray dress, faded from too many washings and too many hard years, clung to her thin frame with perspiration and despair. The townspeople gathered in a loose semicircle around her, their faces a mixture of righteous anger and morbid curiosity. Some had come running at the first toll of the bell, dropping their work in the fields or abandoning their shops. Others approached more slowly, reluctantly, drawn by duty rather than desire. They whispered among themselves, their voices creating a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the oppressive air. 4 years, old Mrs., Henderson muttered to her neighbor, fanning herself with a torn piece of cardboard. 4 years she's been gone, and now she comes back like nothing happened. Like nothing happened, echoed Sarah Mitchell, bouncing her youngest child on her hip. Tell that to my William's grave. Tell that to all the widows she helped make. Judge Cornelius Blackwood emerged from the courthouse, his black robe somehow managing to look even more severe in the bright sunlight. He was a man who wore authority like armor, his silver beard neatly trimmed and his eyes the color of winter ice. In his hands, he carried a leather portfolio that contained what the town believed to be evidence of Mary Beth's crimes that had torn through their community like a plague. Citizens of Millbrook. Judge Blackwood's voice carried easily across the square. Trained by years of commanding courtrooms and town halls, we are gathered here today to address the return of Mary Beth Calloway, who stands accused of conspiracy with the Brennan gang in their depredations against our community. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shouted their agreement. Others simply nodded grimly. Mary Beth herself remained silent, her green eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, as if she could will herself away from this place, away from these accusations, away from the weight of their collective hatred. The charges are serious, the judge continued, opening his portfolio with deliberate ceremony. Association with known criminals, providing aid and comfort to enemies of the peace, conspiracy in the robbery of the Millbrook Bank, which resulted in the death of 3 citizens, including Sheriff Tom Bradley. At the mention of the sheriff's name, several women in the crowd began to weep openly. Tom Bradley had been more than a lawman to this community. He had been a father figure, a protector, a man who knew every child's name and every family's troubles. His death had left a wound that 4 years had not healed. Furthermore, Judge Blackwood's voice grew harder. The accused stand suspected of providing intelligence to the gang regarding the movement of cattle drives and supply wagons, intelligence that led to multiple attacks and the loss of life and property. A rock sailed through the air, striking the post near Mary Beth's head. She flinched but did not cry out, did not turn to see who had thrown it. A child began to wail somewhere in the crowd, frightened by the tension that seemed to make the very air shimmer with menace. That's enough. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his medical bag in his hand and concern etched deep in the lines of his weathered face. She hasn't even been given a chance to speak for herself. Speak for herself? The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, whose brother had died in one of the gang's raids. What's she going to say, Doc? That she was forced? That she didn't know what those animals were doing while she was warming their beds? The crowd's murmur grew uglier. More dangerous. Someone else shouted for rope. Another voice called for justice. Mary Beth's eyes flickered for just a moment, the first sign of fear she had shown since being dragged to the post that morning. Judge Blackwood raised his hand for silence. The law will be followed here, he said firmly. We are not a mob. We are civilized people, and we will conduct ourselves accordingly. Civilized? Martha Bradley, the sheriff's widow, pushed through the crowd until she stood directly in front of Mary Beth. Her face was pale, except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks, and her hands shook as she pointed an accusing finger. You call it civilized to let this woman walk free after what she's done, after the blood on her hands? I never— Mary Beth spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear. Don't you dare! Martha's voice rose to nearly a shriek. Don't you dare speak his name or claim innocence. I know what you are. We all know what you are. The crowd pressed closer, and for a moment it seemed as though the thin veneer of law and order might crumble entirely. Judge Blackwood stepped between Martha and the accused, his presence imposing enough to force the crowd back a step. Mrs. Bradley, I understand your grief, he said gently. But we must follow proper procedure. The accused will have an opportunity to speak, as is her right under the law. And then, Jake Morrison called out. What then? Judge, you planning to let her walk out of here? Judge Blackwood's expression was grim. The penalty for conspiracy and crimes resulting in death is severe. If found guilty, the accused faces— He paused, looking directly at Mary Beth for the first time. The accused faces the ultimate penalty under territorial law. The crowd fell silent at this pronouncement. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Mary Beth's composure finally cracked, just slightly, and she closed her eyes as if trying to shut out the world around her. However, the judge continued, the law also provides for certain considerations. If any citizen can provide testimony to the accused's character, or if there are mitigating circumstances that the court should consider, they must be heard. He looked around the assembled townspeople, his gaze sweeping over faces that had hardened with 4 years of grief and anger. Does anyone here speak for the accused? Does anyone here have knowledge that might shed light on these charges? The silence stretched long and thin, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the sparse grass of the square. Mary Beth opened her eyes and looked out over the sea of hostile faces, people she had once known, people she had once called neighbors. Their silence was as damning as any testimony. Judge Blackwood nodded slowly, as if he had expected no less. Very well. In the absence of any testimony on behalf of the accused, and given the serious nature of the charges, this court finds sufficient cause to— She's my wife. The words rang out clear and strong from the back of the crowd, causing heads to turn and conversations to die mid-sentence. The voice belonged to a man, though from where Mary Beth stood, she could not yet see who had spoken. The crowd began to part reluctantly, like water around a stone, as someone made his way toward the front of the assembly. Judge Blackwood lowered his papers, his eyebrows drawn together in confusion. I beg your pardon. I said she's my wife. The man emerged from the crowd, and Mary Beth felt her breath catch in her throat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that marked him as a working man. His face was familiar, though changed by time and hardship, and his eyes held a determination that seemed to burn in the summer heat. Ethan Graves, Judge Blackwood said slowly, recognition dawning in his voice. The blacksmith. That's right. Ethan stepped closer to the post where Mary Beth stood bound, though he did not look at her directly. His attention remained fixed on the judge. And I'm telling you that Mary Beth Calloway is my lawfully wedded wife, married before God and witnessed by this community. Whatever charges you think you have against her, you'll have to go through me first. The crowd erupted in voices, some shocked, some angry, some simply confused. Judge Blackwood held up his hand again, but it took longer this time for the noise to subside. Mr. Graves, the judge said carefully, I have no record of any such marriage, and I believe I would remember performing such a ceremony. You didn't perform it, Ethan replied evenly. Reverend Matthews did, before he passed, and before you ask. The witnesses were his daughter Lucy and old Pete from the livery stable. Both of them can vouch for what they saw, if you care to ask. Mary Beth stared at him in amazement, her mind reeling. She remembered Ethan Graves, remembered him as a quiet man who had always been kind to her in the days before everything went wrong. But this was impossible. They had never been married. She would have remembered such a thing. Judge Blackwood was consulting his portfolio again, flipping through pages with increasing agitation. "Even if such a marriage took place," he said finally, "it does not absolve the accused of criminal charges, doesn't it?" Ethan's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "According to Territorial Statute 47, subsection 12, a man has the right to speak for his wife in all legal matters, and according to the doctrine of marital privilege, testimony regarding the private communications between husband and wife is inadmissible in court." The judge's face had gone very pale. "Where did you learn about such statutes?" "Mr. Graves?" "I read, Your Honor, and I know my rights." Ethan finally turned to look at Marybeth, and something in his expression made her heart skip a beat. "Our rights." For a long moment, the only sound in the square was the whisper of wind and the distant tolling of the church bell, which had continued its slow, mournful rhythm throughout the proceedings. Judge Blackwood appeared to be weighing his options, acutely aware that the eyes of the entire community were upon him. "Very well," he said at last. "If you can produce witnesses to this alleged marriage, and if the marriage can be verified as legitimate, then the court will take it under consideration. However, given the serious nature of these charges and the unusual circumstances of this claim, I am prepared to offer a compromise." He looked from Ethan to Marybeth and back again. "You will have 7 days to live as man and wife, under the observation of this community. If, at the end of that time, the court is satisfied that your marriage is genuine and that Mrs. Graves," he emphasized the name with slight distaste, "has renounced any association with criminal elements, then the charges against her will be reconsidered." "And if we refuse?" Ethan asked. Judge Blackwood's smile was thin and cold. "Then Mrs. Calloway will face the full penalty of the law. I suggest you choose wisely." Ethan walked to the post where Marybeth stood bound, producing a knife from his belt. The crowd watched in tense silence as he cut through the ropes that held her, his movements careful and deliberate. When the bonds fell away, Marybeth rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed them raw, but she did not thank him. She did not speak at all. 7 days, Judge Blackwood repeated. "Use them well." As the crowd began to disperse, still murmuring among themselves about this unexpected turn of events, Marybeth finally looked directly at Ethan Graves. Her green eyes were full of questions and suspicion, but underneath it all was something that might have been hope. "Why?" she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. Ethan's answer was equally soft, meant for her ears alone. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, even you, even me." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Marybeth standing alone by the post in the center of the square. Free, but not forgiven. Saved, but not yet safe. The sun had moved only a hand's width across the cloudless sky when Ethan Graves appeared at the door of his blacksmith shop, wiping his hands on a leather apron stained black with soot and honest sweat. He had been shoeing horses when the church bell began its ominous tolling, but unlike most of the townsfolk, he had not immediately abandoned his work to join the gathering in the square. Now, as he stood in the doorway looking across the dusty street toward the crowd, his weathered face was unreadable. The hammer he still held in his right hand caught the afternoon light, and for a moment he seemed to weigh it against some invisible burden before setting it aside on his workbench. Marybeth Calloway's voice carried on the hot wind, not her words, which were too distant to make out, but the tone of desperation that had crept into what had once been a proud voice. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he removed his apron with deliberate movements, folding it carefully before hanging it on its designated hook. He had been expecting this day for 4 years. The crowd had grown larger since the proceedings began, drawing people from the surrounding farms and ranches like moths to a flame. As Ethan made his way across the square, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step, he could hear the ugly murmur of voices growing more heated with each passing minute. blood on her hands. Should have been hanged with the rest of them. Decent folk don't need her kind. Ethan's stride never faltered, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had heard these same voices 4 years ago, calling for justice and vengeance in equal measure. Then, as now, they spoke of things they did not understand, of situations more complex than their righteous anger could comprehend. He pushed through the outer ring of spectators, his broad shoulders parting the crowd like the prow of a ship cutting through choppy water. A few people recognized him and nodded respectfully. Ethan Graves was known as a fair man, one who kept his word and minded his own business. He shod their horses and mended their tools without judgment or gossip, and in return they accorded him the quiet respect due to a craftsman who knew his trade. But today was different. Today he was about to shatter that careful distance he had maintained between himself and the affairs of Millbrook. As he moved closer to the center of the square, Ethan caught his first clear glimpse of Mary Beth in 4 years. The sight hit him like a physical blow, though he was careful not to let his reaction show on his face. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had been weathered by sun and hardship. Her dress, once a respectable blue, had faded to the color of storm clouds, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders in a way that would have scandalized the ladies of Millbrook under normal circumstances. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Those green eyes that had once sparkled with laughter and mischief now held only wariness and a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of trials he could only imagine. Judge Blackwood was reading from his portfolio, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority as he detailed the charges against her. Each accusation fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of fresh anger through the assembled crowd. Ethan listened to every word, his expression growing darker with each mention of the Brennan gang and their crimes. He knew about the Brennan gang. He knew more than anyone in this crowd suspected. When Martha Bradley pushed forward to confront Mary Beth directly, Ethan felt his control begin to slip. Martha's grief was real and terrible, but it was also dangerous in the way that all pain became dangerous when it had nowhere else to go. He had seen what grief could do to people, how it could twist them into shapes they would not recognize in calmer moments. "I know what you are," Martha was saying, her voice breaking with emotion. "We all know what you are." The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Ethan could see the exact moment when the gathering transformed from a legal proceeding into something far more primitive and dangerous. He had witnessed such transformations before, in other towns, in other circumstances. He knew how quickly reason could abandon a crowd, how fast justice could become vengeance. Judge Blackwood was trying to maintain order, but even his authority was beginning to feel fragile in the face of so much accumulated anger. When he asked for anyone to speak on Mary Beth's behalf, the silence that followed was damning in its completeness. This was the moment Ethan had been preparing for, though he had hoped it would never come. "She's my wife." The words left his mouth before he fully realized he had spoken them aloud. They rang out clear and strong across the square, cutting through the murmur of voices like a knife through silk. Every head turned toward him. Every conversation died mid-sentence. He stepped forward, letting the crowd part before him as he made his way toward the stone post where Mary Beth stood bound. He could feel the weight of every stare, could sense the confusion and shock radiating from people who thought they knew him. "She's my wife," he repeated, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. Judge Blackwood's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Ethan Graves, the blacksmith." "That's right." Ethan stopped just outside the circle that had formed around Mary Beth, close enough to see the rope burns on her wrists, close enough to see the way her breath caught when she finally looked directly at him. "And I'm telling you that Mary Beth Calloway is my lawfully wedded wife, married before God and witnessed by this community. Whatever charges you think you have against her, you'll have to go through me first." The crowd erupted into chaos. Voices rose in confusion and anger, demanding explanations, calling him a liar, questioning his sanity. Ethan stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, his eyes locked on Judge Blackwood's face. He had gambled everything on this moment: his reputation, his standing in the community, his carefully constructed life. But as he looked at Mary Beth's shocked expression, at the hope and suspicion warring in her green eyes, he knew he would make the same choice again. "Mr. Graves," Judge Blackwood said when the noise had finally died down enough for him to be heard, "I have no record of any such marriage, and I believe I would remember performing such a ceremony." "You didn't perform it," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Reverend Matthews did, before he passed, and before you ask. The witnesses were his daughter Lucy and old Pete from the livery stable. Both of them can vouch for what they saw, if you care to ask. This was the most dangerous part of his gamble. Reverend Matthews had indeed died 2 years ago, taking whatever secrets he might have kept to his grave. Lucy Matthews had married a traveling preacher and moved to Colorado, far beyond the reach of casual inquiry. And old Pete, well, Pete's memory had been failing for years, and he might remember whatever version of events was suggested to him most persuasively. But Judge Blackwood didn't know any of that. More importantly, the territorial statutes that Ethan was about to cite were real, even if the marriage they were meant to protect was not, even if such a marriage took place, the judge said carefully, clearly trying to find solid legal ground in this unexpected swamp. "It does not absolve the accused of criminal charges, doesn't it?" Ethan let a note of challenge creep into his voice. "According to Territorial Statute 47, subsection 12, a man has the right to speak for his wife in all legal matters. And according to the doctrine of marital privilege, testimony regarding the private communications between husband and wife is inadmissible in court." Judge Blackwood's face went pale. "Where did you learn about such statutes, Mr. Graves?" "I read, Your Honor, and I know my rights." Ethan finally allowed himself to look directly at Mary Beth, and the gratitude he saw in her eyes nearly undid him. "Our rights." The judge was clearly struggling with this unexpected development. Ethan could see him weighing the legal implications against the political reality of a community demanding justice. The compromise he eventually offered was perhaps the best outcome Ethan could have hoped for under the circumstances. 7 days, Judge Blackwood announced. "You will have 7 days to live as man and wife, under the observation of this community. If, at the end of that time, the court is satisfied that your marriage is genuine and that Mrs. Graves has renounced any association with criminal elements, then the charges against her will be reconsidered." Ethan nodded once, curtly. "And if we refuse?" The judge's smile was thin and cold. "Then Mrs. Calloway will face the full penalty of the law. I suggest you choose wisely." With steady hands, Ethan drew the knife from his belt and approached the post where Mary Beth stood. The crowd watched in absolute silence as he cut through the ropes that bound her wrists, his movements careful not to cause her any additional pain. When the bonds fell away, she rubbed her chafed wrists but said nothing. 7 days, Judge Blackwood repeated. "Use them well." As the crowd began to disperse, their voices rising in animated discussion about this unexpected turn of events, Ethan found himself alone with Mary Beth for the first time in 4 years. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part suspicion, part something that might have been fear. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of departing footsteps. Ethan studied her face, seeing the girl she had been beneath the woman she had become. 4 years ago, he had made a choice that had haunted him ever since. Today, he was making another choice, one that might finally allow him to live with the first. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said quietly. "Even you, even me." He turned to go, knowing that if he stayed any longer, he might say things that were better left unspoken. But her voice stopped him before he had taken more than a few steps. "Ethan." The way she said his name carried echoes of the past, of conversations by lamplight and stolen moments when the world had seemed full of possibility. "We were never married." He looked back at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "We are now." As he walked away, leaving her standing alone by the post in the center of the square. Ethan felt the weight of the entire town's attention on his back. By evening, word of what had happened here would have spread to every farm and ranch within 50 miles. By tomorrow, he would be either a hero or a fool, depending on who was doing the telling, but for the first time in 4 years, Ethan Graves slept soundly, knowing that he had finally done the right thing, even if it had taken him far too long to find the courage to do it. The cabin sat at the edge of Millbrook like a forgotten memory, its weathered boards gray as storm clouds and its roof sagging under the weight of neglect. Weeds had grown tall around the foundation, and somewhere in the crooked chimney, birds had built their nests, their cheerful songs a stark contrast to the melancholy that seemed to emanate from the structure itself. Mary Beth stood at the broken gate, her hand resting on the splintered wood as she stared at what Ethan Graves claimed would be their home for the next 7 days. The irony was not lost on her. This was the very cabin where she had lived as a child, before her father had died and left her orphaned, before the town had decided she was more burden than blessing. "I know it's not much," Ethan said quietly, coming up behind her with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. "But it's got 4 walls and a roof, mostly." She didn't respond immediately, her green eyes taking in every detail of the dilapidated structure. The front porch sagged on one side where a support beam had rotted through, and the shutters hung at odd angles like broken wings. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. "Why here?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan set down his bag and began examining the gate's broken hinges. "Because it's far enough from town that folks won't be constantly peering through the windows, but close enough that they'll know we're actually living together. And because—" He paused, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Because sometimes going home is the only way to move forward." Mary Beth's jaw tightened. "This was never my home. Not really." "No," Ethan agreed, producing a small tool from his pocket and beginning to work on the gate. "But it could be for 7 days. Anyway." The gate swung open with a protesting squeal, and Ethan gestured for her to precede him up the overgrown path. Mary Beth hesitated for a moment, then stepped through, her worn boots crushing the tall grass that had once been a garden. She could almost see her younger self playing among these weeds, back when they had been flowers and her father had still been alive to tend them. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the grimy windows, and the air smelled of mouse droppings and old wood. But underneath those odors was something else, something that might have been lavender, a ghost of her mother's favorite scent. "The roof leaks," Ethan observed, pointing to a dark stain on the ceiling above what had once been the kitchen area, but only in one corner. "And the chimney draws well enough, once you clear out the birds' nests." Mary Beth wandered through the 3 small rooms, her fingertips trailing along surfaces that had once been familiar. The bedroom where her parents had slept, the main room where her father had read to her by lamplight, the tiny kitchen where her mother had taught her to make biscuits before the fever took her. "There's a well out back," Ethan continued, seemingly oblivious to her distress. "Water's sweet, and the pump still works. I checked yesterday." She turned to stare at him. "Yesterday?" "I've been keeping an eye on the place," he admitted, not meeting her gaze. "Thought someone should. For 4 years? For 4 years." Mary Beth sank onto the wooden crate that served as the room's only chair, suddenly exhausted. "You knew I'd come back." "I hoped you would." Ethan set his bag on the floor and began unpacking supplies: coffee, flour, salt pork, a small sack of beans, though I'll admit I didn't expect it to be under these circumstances. She watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way he seemed to know exactly where everything should go. "You've been planning this." Planning is a strong word. Ethan found an old pot on a shelf and began examining it for holes. "Let's say I've been prepared for possibilities." "What possibilities?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with 4 years of suspicion and hard-learned wariness. Ethan paused in his examination of the pot, his broad shoulders tensing slightly. The possibility that someday you'd need help. The possibility that when that day came, I'd finally have the courage to give it. "And what makes you think I need help?" Mary Beth stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What makes you think I need saving?" "The rope marks on your wrists," Ethan said quietly, not turning around. "The way you flinch when people move too fast. The fact that you came back to a town that wants to see you hang, even though you had to know what kind of reception you'd get." Mary Beth's breath caught in her throat. "You don't know anything about why I came back." "No," Ethan agreed, finally turning to face her. "But I know you. I knew you before, and I can see enough of that girl in your eyes to know that you didn't come back to cause trouble. You came back because you had nowhere else to go." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had indeed run out of places to hide, run out of people willing to help a woman with her reputation. Millbrook had been her last option, and even that had nearly gotten her killed. "You left," she said suddenly, the accusation hanging between them like smoke. "When things got bad, when the gang came, you left." Ethan's face went very still. "Yes, I did. You could have warned me. You could have told me what they were planning." "I could have." His voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "I should have, but you didn't." Mary Beth took a step closer, her voice rising. "You saved yourself and left me to face the consequences alone." "I was a coward," Ethan said simply. "I was young and scared, and I made the worst decision of my life. I've regretted it every day since. Regret doesn't bring back the dead." The words came out in a whisper, but they seemed to fill the entire room. Regret doesn't undo 4 years of running, of hiding, of being afraid to sleep in the same place twice. Ethan set down the pot and took a careful step toward her. "No, it doesn't, but maybe it's a place to start." Mary Beth laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Start what? This farce of a marriage? This elaborate lie you've told to keep me from hanging?" "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or maybe it's a chance for both of us to stop running." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. For the first time, she noticed the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. "What have you been running from?" "The same thing you have," he said. "The past, the choices we made, the people we couldn't save." Before she could respond, he turned back to his unpacking, his movements brisk and purposeful. "I'll sleep in the main room," he announced. "You can have the bedroom. There's a bar for the door, if it makes you feel safer." Mary Beth stared at his back, confusion warring with suspicion. "Just like that? Just like that? And you expect me to believe this is all altruistic? That you're risking your reputation, your standing in the community, just to help me?" Ethan paused, his hand stilling on a small sack of coffee beans. "I expect you to believe whatever you need to believe to get through the next 7 days. After that," he shrugged, "after that, you'll be free to go wherever you want. I won't stop you." The offer should have been comforting, but instead it left her feeling strangely hollow. Freedom to go where? To do what? She had no money, no family, no friends. The skills she had learned over the past 4 years were not the kind that respectable people valued. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "There's a garden plot out back. Needs work, but the soil's still good. And the town could use a seamstress. Mrs. Henderson's getting too old for all the mending, and her eyes aren't what they used to be. You think they'd trust me with their clothes?" Mary Beth couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "The same people who wanted to see me hang this morning?" "People have short memories when it comes to their convenience," Ethan said pragmatically. "Give them a month of good work at fair prices, and they'll forget why they were angry in the first place. And what about you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "What do you get out of all this?" Ethan was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Peace, maybe. The chance to look at myself in the mirror without feeling sick. The knowledge that when it mattered most, I finally did the right thing." He straightened up and faced her, his expression serious. "I know you don't trust me, Marybeth. I know you have every reason to hate me, but I'm asking you to give me these 7 days. Let me try to make up for what I didn't do 4 years ago." Marybeth studied his face, searching for signs of deception, for the hidden agenda she was sure must exist. But all she saw was exhaustion, regret, and something that might have been hope. "And if I say no?" she asked. "If I decide I'd rather take my chances with Judge Blackwood? Then I'll walk you back to town myself," Ethan said without hesitation. "And I'll make sure you get a fair trial, even if I have to hire a lawyer from Dallas to defend you." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she'd learned about human nature over the past 4 years, that it left her speechless. In her experience, men always wanted something in return for their help. Always. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Ethan's smile was sad and tired and completely without artifice. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. Marybeth, even people who've made terrible mistakes. Even people who've given up on themselves." He picked up his bag and headed for the door. "I'll be outside if you need anything. Take your time deciding." After he left, Marybeth sank back onto the wooden crate and let her head fall into her hands. 4 years ago. She would have trusted him without question. 4 years ago, she had been young enough to believe that people were fundamentally good, that help offered was help genuinely given. But 4 years was a long time, long enough to learn that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, long enough to discover what people were capable of when they thought no one was watching. Through the broken window, she could see Ethan examining the well pump, his movements careful and methodical. As she watched, he removed his shirt and began priming the handle, his back and shoulders gleaming with sweat in the afternoon sun. There was something peaceful about the sight, something that reminded her of simpler times when the world had made sense and the future had seemed full of possibility. Maybe, she thought, it was time to stop running, at least for 7 days. Maybe it was time to find out if second chances were really possible, or if they were just another beautiful lie told by people too naive to know better. Either way, she was too tired to keep running, and for the first time in 4 years, she didn't have to. The first visitor arrived before the morning dew had fully evaporated from the overgrown grass around the cabin. Marybeth heard the creak of wagon wheels and the gentle snorting of horses while she was still braiding her hair in the cracked mirror that hung in the bedroom. Through the window, she could see a familiar figure climbing down from a buckboard loaded with supplies. Mrs. Clara Henderson, the town's unofficial moral authority and keeper of social order, had come calling. Marybeth's stomach clenched as she watched the elderly woman smooth her black dress and adjust her bonnet before approaching the front door. Mrs. Henderson had never approved of Marybeth, even before the troubles began. The woman had a talent for finding fault where others saw none, and her disapproval carried weight in a community that valued respectability above almost everything else. "Ethan." "Mrs." Henderson called out in her carrying voice. "I've brought some things for your household." Marybeth could hear Ethan's boots on the wooden floor as he moved toward the door. He had been up since before dawn, she knew, working to repair the sagging porch and clear the birds' nests from the chimney. She had watched him from her window, noting the methodical way he approached each task, as if he could rebuild more than just the physical structure of the place. "Mrs. Henderson." Ethan's voice was polite but cautious. "That's very kind of you." "Well, I couldn't have it said that Millbrook doesn't take care of its own," the woman replied, though her tone suggested she had serious reservations about whether Marybeth qualified for such consideration, even in unusual circumstances. Marybeth took a deep breath and stepped out of the bedroom, her chin held high despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. Mrs. Henderson's pale blue eyes immediately fixed on her, cataloging every detail from her hastily mended dress to her carefully braided hair. "Mrs. Henderson," Marybeth said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. How thoughtful of you to visit. Mrs. Graves, the older woman replied, emphasizing the surname with barely concealed skepticism. I trust you're settling in well? The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Mary Beth could feel the weight of judgment behind it, the unspoken demand for proof that this marriage was genuine rather than the desperate fabrication many suspected it to be. We're managing, Mary Beth replied carefully. Ethan has been very attentive to my comfort. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly at this, and she glanced between them with shrewd eyes. I'm sure he has. Marriage is such a blessing when both parties are committed to making it work. Ethan stepped closer to Mary Beth, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. My wife has had a difficult time, he said evenly, but we're looking forward to building a life together here in Millbrook. Of course you are. Mrs. Henderson's smile was thin as winter ice. It's just so surprising that such a union managed to escape the notice of the community for so long. Reverend Matthews was usually quite diligent about recording such important events. The Reverend was a private man, Ethan replied. He understood that some couples prefer a quiet ceremony. Indeed. Mrs. Henderson began unpacking items from a large basket she had brought with her, a jar of preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, some potatoes that still had dirt clinging to their skins. Well, I've brought a few necessities to help you get established. The Lord knows it's a wife's duty to keep a proper household, regardless of the circumstances that bring her to it. Mary Beth accepted the items with as much grace as she could muster, though the woman's words stung like salt in an open wound. Thank you. Your generosity is most appreciated. Think nothing of it. Mrs. Henderson's gaze swept over the cabin's interior, taking in the sparse furnishings and obvious signs of recent occupancy. Though I do hope you'll be joining us for Sunday services this week. The congregation would be interested to welcome you back into the fold. The threat was delicately phrased, but unmistakable. Show yourselves in church. Prove your respectability. Submit to the community's judgment. Mary Beth felt Ethan's hand brush against hers, a brief touch that somehow steadied her nerves. We'll certainly consider it, Ethan said diplomatically. Wonderful. Mrs. Henderson gathered up her empty basket and moved toward the door. Oh, and Mary Beth, dear, I do hope you'll remember that a wife's behavior reflects on her husband's reputation. I'm sure you wouldn't want to do anything to compromise Ethan's standing in the community. After the woman left, Mary Beth sank onto the wooden crate that served as their only chair, her hands shaking slightly. She knows, she whispered. She knows this isn't real. Maybe, Ethan agreed, settling onto the floor nearby. But knowing and proving are two different things. As long as we're careful, as long as we don't give them any obvious contradictions, there will be others. Mary Beth interrupted. This is just the beginning. She was right. Over the next 3 days, a steady stream of visitors found excuses to call on the newlyweds. Dr. Harrison came by to check on Mary Beth's health, his kind eyes searching her face for signs of abuse or coercion. Sarah Mitchell arrived with her youngest child, ostensibly to borrow some sugar, but really to observe how the couple interacted when they thought no one was watching. Jake Morrison stopped by to discuss horseshoes with Ethan, but spent most of his visit studying Mary Beth with suspicious eyes. Even young Timothy Walsh, barely 16 and usually too shy to speak to adults, managed to find a reason to linger near their gate while pretending to chase a runaway chicken. Each visit was a test, a careful probing for cracks in their hastily constructed facade. The visitors asked seemingly innocent questions about their courtship, their wedding day, their plans for the future. They watched for signs of intimacy or its absence, for the small gestures and unconscious habits that marked a genuine marriage. Mary Beth found herself growing increasingly tense under the constant scrutiny. She jumped when Ethan moved too suddenly, flinched when he reached for something near her, maintained a careful distance that probably looked more suspicious than natural. They were like actors in a play, But neither of them knew their lines well enough to convince a skeptical audience. On the fourth evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sun set over the distant hills, Mary Beth finally voiced what had been bothering her all day. "We're failing," she said quietly. "They can tell we're not really married." Ethan considered this, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "What makes you say that?" "The way Mrs. Patterson looked at us today when we were standing by the well. The questions Timothy Walsh asked about where we spent our wedding night. The fact that Dr. Harrison felt the need to examine my arms for bruises." Mary Beth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the evening chill. "They're looking for evidence that this is all pretense. And what would convince them otherwise?" The question was asked so quietly that Mary Beth almost didn't hear it. When she turned to look at Ethan, she found him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been married before. I don't know what they expect to see." "Neither have I," Ethan said. "But I think maybe we've been trying too hard to maintain distance. Real married couples, especially newlyweds, they touch each other. Not inappropriately," he added hastily, seeing her expression. "But they stand closer together. They move in sync. They look at each other in a certain way." Mary Beth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You want me to pretend to be affectionate with you?" "Only when people are watching," Ethan said quickly. "Only enough to make it believable. I'm not asking for anything more than that." She studied his face in the fading light, searching for signs of deception or hidden desire. But all she saw was the same careful respect he had shown her from the beginning, tinged now with what might have been embarrassment. "What did you have in mind?" she asked finally. "Small things. Standing closer when we talk to visitors. Maybe letting me put my hand on your back when we're walking together. Calling each other by our given names instead of being so formal." The suggestions were reasonable, even sensible. But the thought of deliberately encouraging physical contact with any man, even one who had shown her nothing but kindness, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "I'll try," she said finally. "But if I pull away or seem uncomfortable, then we stop immediately," Ethan assured her. "The last thing I want is to make you feel unsafe." The next morning brought another visitor, this time in the form of Margaret Foster, the minister's wife who had taken over many of the church's social duties since Reverend Matthews's death. She arrived with a basket of mending and a determined expression that suggested she planned to stay for a while. "I thought I might sit with you for a bit," she announced, settling herself on the porch steps without waiting for an invitation. "It gets lonely out here, I imagine, especially for a woman who's been away from home for so long." Mary Beth accepted the implied criticism with as much grace as she could muster. "It's very peaceful," she replied. "Sometimes peace is exactly what a person needs." "Oh, I'm sure." Mrs. Foster began sorting through her mending, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she watched Ethan emerge from the blacksmith's forge he had set up behind the cabin. "Though I do think it's important for married couples to maintain connections with their community. Isolation can be unhealthy for a relationship." As if summoned by her words, Ethan appeared around the corner of the house, his shirt damp with sweat and his arms streaked with soot. When he saw Mrs. Foster, he nodded politely but continued toward the well where Mary Beth was sitting. This was their moment, Mary Beth realized. Their first real test of the new approach they had discussed the night before. When Ethan reached for the water bucket, Mary Beth stood and moved closer to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Let me help you with that," she said, her voice softer than usual. Ethan glanced at her in surprise, then seemed to understand what she was doing. "Thank you," he said, and when she handed him the bucket, he let his fingers brush against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Mrs. Foster watched this exchange with sharp interest, her needle pausing in its work. "It's so lovely to see a couple working together," she commented, Marriage requires such cooperation, doesn't it? Indeed it does. Ethan agreed, and to Mary Beth's surprise, he rested his hand gently on her lower back as he spoke. The touch was light, respectful, but unmistakably intimate. I'm very fortunate to have found a partner who understands the value of shared efforts. Mary Beth felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from something else entirely. The warmth of his hand through the thin fabric of her dress was strangely comforting, and for a moment she found herself leaning slightly into the contact before catching herself. "How sweet," Mrs. Foster said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "And how fortunate that you were able to find each other again after so many years apart." "Some things are worth waiting for," Ethan replied, his eyes meeting Mary Beth's for just a moment before he turned back to Mrs. Foster. "Sometimes it takes time to recognize what's been right in front of you all along." Something in his voice made Mary Beth look at him more closely, but his expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Mrs. Foster continued her probing questions for another hour, but Mary Beth found herself relaxing as the conversation progressed. Ethan seemed to know exactly when to touch her arm during a story, when to share a meaningful glance, when to speak about their courtship with just the right mixture of fondness and privacy. By the time Mrs. Foster finally gathered up her mending and departed, Mary Beth felt cautiously optimistic that they had passed this particular test, but as she watched the woman's buggy disappear down the dusty road, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest challenges still lay ahead. "That went well," Ethan said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the gate. "Better than expected." Mary Beth agreed. Then, almost without thinking, she added, "Thank you for making it easier." Ethan turned to look at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. "We make a good team," he said finally. As they walked back to the house together, Mary Beth found herself wondering if that might actually be true. And for the first time since this strange arrangement began, the thought didn't terrify her quite as much as she expected it to. The ancient oak tree stood at the crossroads just outside of town, its massive trunk scarred by time and weather, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. It was a landmark older than Millbrook itself, a silent witness to countless human dramas played out in its shadow. But it was also a tree with a darker history, one that every resident of the town knew but few spoke of openly. The Hanging Tree. They called it in whispers. The place where justice had been dispensed in the early days, before Judge Blackwood and proper courts had brought civilized law to the territory. Now, years later, the only remnants of those grim times were the iron ring still embedded in the massive trunk and the weathered rope that someone had left coiled at the base of the tree, more as a warning than a memorial. Mary Beth stood in the shade of the oak on the morning of their 6th day, staring up at those twisted branches while Ethan spoke quietly with Dr. Harrison a few yards away. The old physician had arrived at dawn with an unusual proposal, one that had taken both of them by surprise. "The town council met last night," Dr. Harrison was saying, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he paced nervously. "There's been discussion about your situation. Some folks are satisfied with what they've seen so far, but others remain skeptical." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of discussion?" "The kind that could go badly for both of you if something isn't done to put their doubts to rest." The doctor glanced toward Mary Beth, then back to Ethan. "Judge Blackwood is feeling pressure to make a final determination. There are those who think 7 days isn't enough time to prove the authenticity of a marriage, especially one that was supposedly kept secret for so long." Mary Beth felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm morning air. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "A public renewal of vows," he said, the words coming out in a rush as if he wanted to get them out before he lost his nerve. "Here, under the oak, with proper witnesses. Something that would satisfy even the most skeptical members of the community." The irony of the location was not lost on any of them. To hold a wedding ceremony beneath the hanging tree would be either a powerful symbol of redemption or a terrible temptation to those who still harbored doubts about Mary Beth's innocence. "Who would perform the ceremony?" Ethan asked carefully. "Reverend Foster has agreed to officiate." Dr. Harrison replied, "And Mrs. Henderson has offered to serve as the primary witness, along with several other prominent members of the community." Mary Beth almost laughed at that. Mrs. Henderson, who had made no secret of her suspicions about their marriage, would be watching every word, every gesture, every fleeting expression for signs of deception. "And if we refuse?" she asked. Dr. Harrison's expression grew grave. "Then Judge Blackwood will likely rule tomorrow that there's insufficient evidence of a genuine marriage. The charges against you will be reinstated, and—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what the penalty would be. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the iron ring in the oak's trunk. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but resigned. "When would this ceremony take place?" "This afternoon. If you're willing, the word has already been spread. People will be expecting an answer." Mary Beth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the town's expectations settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. 6 days ago, she had been prepared to die. Now she was being asked to participate in an elaborate charade of love and commitment, all for the entertainment and satisfaction of people who would never truly trust her again. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Dr. Harrison nodded understandingly. "Of course, but don't take too long. The council expects an answer by noon." After the doctor left, Mary Beth and Ethan stood in uncomfortable silence beneath the oak tree. The morning was growing warmer, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of hammering as the townspeople went about their daily business, blissfully unaware of the drama being played out at the crossroads. "We don't have to do this," Ethan said quietly. "If you'd rather take your chances with the judge, we both know how that would end." Mary Beth interrupted. "The question is whether you're willing to go through with it. This ceremony, it would be even more public than what we've been doing. More lies to tell, more people to convince." Ethan picked up a fallen branch and began stripping the bark from it with his thumbnail, a nervous habit she had noticed over the past few days. "The lies don't bother me as much as they should," he admitted. "What bothers me is asking you to make promises you don't mean, to stand before God and the community and speak words that—" He trailed off, but Mary Beth understood what he was trying to say. "Words that bind us together in a way that has nothing to do with legal protection." "Yes." She studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands worked at the branch as if it were the source of all his troubles. "What if they weren't lies?" she asked suddenly. Ethan's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" What if we made them real? Not the marriage itself, necessarily, but the promises, the commitment to try, to see if what we've built over these past 6 days could become something more than just survival." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. 6 days ago, she wouldn't have trusted Ethan Graves with her life. Now she was suggesting they trust each other with something far more precious, the possibility of a future together. "Mary Beth," Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the hope underneath it. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that maybe we don't have to pretend anymore." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to admit. "These past few days, watching you work to make that old cabin into something like a home, seeing the way you've protected me without asking for anything in return, I've started to remember why I used to think you were a good man." "Used to?" "Before everything went wrong. Before the Brennan gang. Before I learned that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes meeting his brown ones without flinching. "You could have let them hang me, Ethan. You could have stayed in your shop and minded your own business like everyone else. But you didn't." "I couldn't," he said simply. "Not again. I failed you once before. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice." "What happened 4 years ago?" Mary Beth said carefully. "What you did or didn't do. Maybe it's time to stop letting it define us." Ethan dropped the stripped branch and turned to face her completely. "What are you asking of me, Mary Beth?" "I'm asking if you think we could make this work. Not the pretense, not the performance for the town's benefit, but an actual marriage, an actual partnership." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I'm asking if you could love someone like me." The question hung between them like morning mist, fragile and ephemeral. For a moment, Mary Beth thought she had made a terrible mistake, that she had revealed too much, asked for more than he was willing to give. Then Ethan reached out and took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. "Mary Beth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been in love with you since before you left, since before the gang came, since before everything went wrong. That's why I couldn't warn you, because I was too much of a coward to admit how I felt. And by the time I found the courage, it was too late." The confession hit her like a physical blow. "You... what? I was going to ask you to marry me," he continued, the words spilling out as if he'd been holding them back for years. "I had it all planned out. I was going to come to your house after church that Sunday, ask your permission to court you properly. But then the gang rode in, and you were gone. And I thought..." He swallowed hard. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Mary Beth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Why didn't you ever say anything? In all these years, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't think I had the right. Because I thought you deserved better than a man who'd proven himself a coward when it mattered most." Ethan's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Because I was afraid you'd see right through me and realize that everything I've done these past 6 days has been as much for my own sake as for yours." "What do you mean?" "I mean that claiming you as my wife wasn't entirely altruistic," he admitted. "I mean that every moment we've spent together, every small kindness you've shown me, every time you've let me touch you without pulling away, it's been like getting pieces of my soul back." The honesty in his voice, the raw vulnerability of the confession, broke something loose inside Mary Beth's chest. For 4 years, she had built walls around her heart, convinced herself that love was another luxury she couldn't afford. But standing here in the shadow of the hanging tree, feeling the warmth of Ethan's hands and seeing the truth in his eyes, those walls began to crumble. "I don't know if I remember how to love someone," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm even capable of it anymore. Then we'll learn together," Ethan said gently. "We'll take it one day at a time, one small step at a time. No pressure, no expectations beyond what we both feel ready for." Mary Beth looked up at the massive oak tree, at the iron ring that had once held nooses, but now seemed to catch the morning light like a blessing. "Do you really think it's possible? That we could build something real out of all this pretense?" "I think," Ethan said, lifting one hand to cup her cheek, "that sometimes the best things grow in the most unlikely places. Look at this tree. It's seen death and sorrow, but it's also provided shade and shelter. It's survived storms and droughts and the worst of human nature, and it's still here, still growing." She leaned into his touch, allowing herself to feel safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. "So we do it? We go through with the ceremony?" "We do it," Ethan confirmed. "But this time, when we make those vows, we'll mean them. We'll promise to try, to be patient with each other, to build something together that neither of us could create alone." "Even if it's imperfect? Even if we make mistakes?" "Especially then," Ethan said, and leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Because perfect love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about choosing to forgive them and keep trying anyway." By noon, word had spread throughout Millbrook that the ceremony would indeed take place. People began gathering early, some out of genuine well-wishes, but most out of curiosity and the desire to witness what they expected to be either a touching renewal of vows or a spectacular failure of deception. Mary Beth spent the afternoon preparing herself, not just physically, but emotionally. Mrs. Henderson had brought her a dress, not new, but clean and pressed and appropriate for a wedding. It was pale blue with tiny pearl buttons, and it fit her better than anything she had worn in years. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the townspeople assembled beneath the oak tree. Judge Blackwood was there, his expression stern but not unkind. Dr. Harrison stood nearby with his wife, both of them wearing expressions of cautious optimism. Even some of the younger folks had come, drawn by the novelty of a wedding at the hanging tree. Reverend Foster took his place beneath the massive trunk, his prayer book open in his hands. Mrs. Henderson positioned herself where she could see every nuance of expression on both their faces. The crowd fell silent as Ethan and Mary Beth approached the tree together, their hands linked but their hearts hammering with nervous anticipation. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Foster began, his voice carrying easily in the still air, "we are gathered here today to witness the renewal of vows between Ethan Graves and Mary Beth Calloway Graves." As the familiar words washed over her, Mary Beth found herself focusing not on the crowd, but on the man standing beside her. Ethan had cleaned up for the occasion, his hair combed back and his best shirt pressed, but it was his eyes that captured her attention. They held no trace of deception, no hint of the desperation that had driven their initial charade. Instead, she saw hope, determination, and something that might actually be love. When the time came for them to speak their vows, Ethan went first. His voice was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the assembled crowd. "Mary Beth," he said, "I promise to stand by you, not just today but for all the days to come. I promise to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, to protect you from harm, and to never again let fear keep me from doing what's right. I promise to love you, not just for who you were or who you might become, but for who you are right now, in this moment." When it was her turn, Mary Beth felt the weight of every eye upon her, but she found that it didn't matter. All that mattered was the man standing before her, waiting for her to choose their future. "Ethan," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I promise to try, to trust you when trust feels impossible, to let you love me even when I don't think I deserve it. I promise to build something new with you, something that honors the past but isn't defined by it. And I promise to love you, not because I have to, but because I choose to." When Reverend Foster pronounced them husband and wife, when Ethan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently beneath the hanging tree, Mary Beth felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't the dramatic transformation of a fairy tale, but something quieter and more real. The first tentative stirring of hope in a heart that had forgotten what it felt like to believe in happy endings. As the crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in continued skepticism, but others nodding in apparent satisfaction, Mary Beth and Ethan remained beneath the oak tree, their hands still linked, their faces glowing in the golden light of the setting sun. "So," Ethan said quietly, "what happens now?" Mary Beth smiled, and for the first time in 4 years, it felt completely genuine. "Now we go home," she said, "and we start learning how to be married for real." Hand in hand, they walked away from the hanging tree toward their future, leaving the shadows of the past behind them at last. The acrid smell of smoke woke Mary Beth from the deepest sleep she had known in years. For a moment, suspended between dreams and waking, she thought she was back in the nightmare, back in the camp with the Brennan gang when everything had gone wrong. Then the sound of crackling flames and the orange glow seeping through the cabin's windows brought her fully awake with a jolt of pure terror. "Ethan!" she called out, rolling from the bed and stumbling toward the main room. But even as his name left her lips, she knew he wasn't there. She had heard him leave before dawn, heading into town to reshoe Mrs. Patterson's mare, promising to return by midday. The front of the house was already engulfed, flames licking hungrily at the wooden walls and consuming the newly repaired porch with devastating efficiency. The heat hit her like a physical blow, and she could see that the path to the front door was already impassable. Choking on the smoke that was beginning to fill the cabin, Mary Beth grabbed the few possessions that mattered: her mother's Bible, the silver locket that held the only photograph of her parents, and ran toward the back door. She burst out into the morning air, gasping and coughing, her nightgown singed at the hem. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. The little garden she had begun to tend, the wildflowers Ethan had planted by the well, the small shed where he kept his tools, all of it had been systematically destroyed. Plants trampled into the dirt, flowers torn up by their roots, tools scattered and broken as if someone had taken great pleasure in the destruction. But it was the message carved into the wooden railing of the back porch that made her legs nearly give out beneath her. 3 words, gouged deep into the wood with something sharp and left to bleed sap in the morning light. Creed remembers all. Mary Beth's hand flew to her throat as memories crashed over her like a cold wave. Jonas Creed, the most vicious member of the Brennan gang, the one who had enjoyed violence for its own sake, who had taken particular pleasure in tormenting anyone weaker than himself. She had hoped he was dead, had prayed that the law or frontier justice had finally caught up with him, but apparently he was very much alive. And he had found her. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop made her spin around, hope and fear warring in her chest. But instead of Ethan's familiar figure, she saw 3 riders cresting the hill that led down to their cabin. Even at a distance, she recognized the easy, predatory way they sat their horses, the casual menace in their posture. Without hesitation, Mary Beth ran. She knew these men, knew what they were capable of, and she knew that Jonas Creed would not have come all this way just to frighten her. Behind her, she could hear the riders spurring their horses, could hear the thunder of hooves as they gave chase. The landscape around Millbrook was harsh and unforgiving, red rock formations jutting up from the desert floor like ancient monuments, arroyos carved deep by flash floods, and scattered patches of scrub brush that offered little in the way of concealment. But Mary Beth had learned to read this country during her years with the gang, had memorized its hiding places and escape routes out of necessity. She made for the maze of rock formations known locally as Devil's Garden, a treacherous area where the stone had been carved by wind and water into a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden caves. It was dangerous country, easy to get lost in, easier to get trapped. But it was also the only place she might be able to lose her pursuers. Behind her, she could hear Jonas Creed's voice echoing off the rocks, taunting her with familiar cruelty. "Come on out, little bird. You can't hide from me forever. I've got something special planned for you and that blacksmith of yours." The mention of Ethan sent fresh terror coursing through her veins. If they had been watching the cabin, they would know his routines, know when he left and when he returned. They would be waiting for him. Mary Beth pressed deeper into the rock maze, her bare feet already cut and bleeding from the sharp stones. She needed to find a place to hide, needed time to think, to plan. Most of all, she needed to find a way to warn Ethan before he rode blindly into Jonas Creed's trap. The narrow passage she was following opened suddenly into a small, natural amphitheater, its walls rising 30 feet on all sides. For a moment, relief flooded through her. This was perfect, a hiding place where she could catch her breath and figure out her next move. Then she heard the slow clapping of hands and turned to see Jonas Creed standing at the only exit, his pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying the same casual menace she remembered from their darkest days. "Look what the cat dragged in, little Mary Beth, all grown up and playing house with a blacksmith." He looked exactly as she remembered him, tall and lean, with the kind of dangerous handsomeness that had fooled many people into underestimating him. His brown hair was longer now, touching his shoulders, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw. But his eyes were the same pale blue that had haunted her nightmares for 4 years. "Hello, Jonas," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I thought you were dead." Disappointed, he stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. "I have to say, I was a little hurt that you left without saying goodbye. 4 years. Mary Beth, 4 years I've been looking for you. What do you want?" "What do I want?" Jonas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I want what's owed to me. You cost me everything when you ran off. My share of the money, my standing with the gang, my freedom. I spent 2 years in territorial prison because of you. Because of me? Mary Beth took a step back, her spine hitting the rock wall. I never betrayed you to the law. I never told them anything. No, but you left, and when you left, everything fell apart. The gang scattered, the jobs went wrong, and I ended up with a rope around my neck. His hand moved to the scar on his throat, and Mary Beth could see the faint white line where the noose had left its mark. Lucky for me, the branch broke. Unlucky for you. I lived to tell about it. The others, dead, all of them. You're the only loose end left, the only one who knows what really happened that night in Millbrook. Jonas's smile was cold as winter moonlight. The only witness to what we did to that sheriff. Mary Beth's blood turned to ice. She had indeed witnessed Sheriff Bradley's death, had seen Jonas Creed gun him down in cold blood during the bank robbery. But she had also seen something else, something that could destroy more than just Jonas if it ever came to light. You're afraid, she realized suddenly. You're afraid of what I might say if they put me on trial. Smart girl. Jonas drew his gun in one smooth motion, the barrel gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. Which is why you're not going to live long enough to stand trial. If you kill me, Ethan will know you were here. He'll tell the law. Your precious blacksmith won't be telling anyone anything. Jonas interrupted. My boys are waiting for him right now. Poor fellow's going to ride into an ambush, never knowing what hit him. A terrible tragedy, losing both his wife and his life on the same day. The words hit Mary Beth like physical blows. In trying to save herself, she had led Jonas Creed right to the man she loved. Ethan would come looking for her, would see the burned cabin and follow her trail into the rocks. And Jonas's men would be waiting for him. Please, she whispered, hating herself for the plea but unable to stop it. He's innocent in all this. He doesn't know anything about what happened 4 years ago. Maybe not, but he knows you. And that's enough. Jonas raised the gun, pointing it directly at her heart. Any last words? Mary Beth closed her eyes, thinking of Ethan's gentle hands and kind eyes, of the life they had been building together, of all the tomorrows they would never see. In her mind, she could hear the echo of the vows they had spoken beneath the oak tree, promises of love and commitment that would die with her in this desolate place. The gunshot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, echoing off the rock walls like thunder. Mary Beth waited for the pain, for the darkness to claim her, but neither came. Instead, she heard Jonas Creed's voice, high and sharp with surprise and pain. She opened her eyes to see him clutching his right shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers, his gun lying in the dust at his feet. Standing at the mouth of the passage, smoke still curling from the barrel of his rifle, was Ethan. Step away from my wife, Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. Jonas spun around, his left hand going for the knife at his belt. Well, if it isn't the hero, come to save your damsel in distress? Something like that. Ethan stepped into the amphitheater, his rifle trained on Jonas's chest. Though I'd say she's been doing a pretty good job of saving herself. You don't know who you're dealing with. Blacksmith, I'm Jonas Creed. I've killed more men than you've shod horses. Maybe, Ethan agreed. But you made one mistake. What's that? You threatened her. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. And I promised never to let anyone hurt her again. Jonas lunged for his fallen gun. But Mary Beth was closer. She dove forward, her hand closing around the weapon just as Jonas's fingers reached it. They struggled for a moment, rolling in the dust. But Mary Beth had desperation on her side. 4 years of running, of hiding, of living in fear had built up a reservoir of rage that finally found its target. The gun went off again, the sound muffled against Jonas's chest. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of profound surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Well, he whispered, his pale eyes finding Mary Beth's face. I guess you win after all. He collapsed backward, his body going limp, his eyes staring sightlessly at the patch of blue sky visible between the rock walls. Mary Beth knelt in the dust beside him, the smoking gun still clutched in her hands. her whole body shaking with reaction. 4 years of nightmares, 4 years of looking over her shoulder, 4 years of fear, all of it ended in this moment, in this desolate place, with the man who had haunted her dreams lying dead at her feet. Mary Beth. Ethan's voice seemed to come from very far away. Mary Beth, look at me. She raised her eyes to his face, seeing concern and love and something that might have been pride. He's dead, she whispered. Yes, he's dead, and you're alive, and that's all that matters. Ethan knelt beside her, gently taking the gun from her trembling hands. It's over. His men, dead. Ethan's voice was grim. I found them waiting in ambush along the road. They won't be bothering anyone ever again. Mary Beth looked at him more closely, noting for the first time the blood on his shirt, the cuts on his hands, the exhaustion in his eyes. Are you hurt? Nothing that won't heal. He helped her to her feet, his arms coming around her in a protective embrace. But you're hurt. Your feet. It doesn't matter. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of honest sweat and leather and safety. You came for me. I'll always come for you, Ethan said simply. That's what husbands do. They stood there in the shadow of the red rocks, holding each other as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermals, and somewhere a coyote called to its pack. But for Mary Beth, there was only this moment, this man, and the incredible realization that she was finally, truly free. The ghosts of her past lay dead in the dust behind her. The future, uncertain as it might be, stretched out before them like an uncharted country full of possibility. Let's go home, she said finally. Ethan looked toward the smoke still rising from their burned cabin. We don't have a home anymore. Yes, we do, Mary Beth said, taking his hand in hers. Home isn't a place. Ethan, it's this. It's us, and as long as we have each other, we'll always have a home. Together, they walked out of Devil's Garden, leaving the shadows of the past behind them forever. The makeshift infirmary in Dr. Harrison's house smelled of carbolic acid and lavender, a combination that somehow managed to be both clinical and comforting. Sunlight filtered through clean white curtains, casting gentle patterns on the wooden floor where Mary Beth had been keeping vigil for 3 days and 3 nights. Ethan lay motionless on the narrow cot, his face pale as winter snow beneath the bandages that wrapped his head and left shoulder. The wounds from his fight with Jonas Creed's men had been worse than he'd initially let on. A bullet graze across his temple that had bled terribly, a knife wound in his shoulder that had missed vital arteries by mere inches, and countless smaller cuts and bruises that spoke of a desperate, violent struggle. Dr. Harrison had cleaned and stitched the wounds with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands steady despite his obvious concern. He's lost a lot of blood, he had told Mary Beth after the initial surgery. The head wound looks worse than it is, but that shoulder, the blade went deep. There could be infection, fever. We'll just have to wait and see. Wait and see. The words had become Mary Beth's entire world for the past 72 hours. She had barely left his side, catching brief moments of sleep in the chair beside his bed, eating only when misses. Harrison forced bowls of soup into her hands. The kind woman had tried to convince her to rest in the spare bedroom, but Mary Beth couldn't bear the thought of being anywhere else. She needed to be here when he woke up. She needed him to know that she was safe, that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. On the second day, fever had set in. Ethan had tossed and turned, his body burning with heat while sweat soaked through the clean sheets. He had spoken in his delirium, calling her name, apologizing for things that weren't his fault, reliving moments from their week together that had clearly meant more to him than she had realized at the time. Should have told her sooner. He had mumbled during one particularly bad spell, his hand reaching out blindly for something he couldn't find. Should have been braver. Mary. I'm sorry. Mary Beth had taken his searching hand in both of hers, her tears falling onto their joined fingers. I'm here, she had whispered. I'm right here. Ethan, you saved me. You came for me just like you promised. Now, as dawn broke on the fourth day, the fever had finally broken. Ethan's breathing was deeper, more natural, and some color had returned to his cheeks, but he still hadn't opened his eyes, still hadn't spoken a coherent word. Dr. Harrison checked on them every few hours, his expression carefully neutral as he changed bandages and monitored Ethan's vital signs. This morning, however, Mary Beth caught a glimpse of something that might have been cautious optimism in the old physician's eyes. "How is he?" she asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and worry. "Better," the doctor replied, pressing his fingers to Ethan's wrist to check his pulse. "The fever's broken, and there's no sign of infection in the wounds. His pulse is stronger too. When will he wake up?" "Soon, I think. The body has its own wisdom about these things. He's been through a terrible ordeal, but he's young and strong. Give him a little more time." After the doctor left, Mary Beth resumed her vigil, studying Ethan's peaceful face in the morning light. Without the tension of consciousness, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. She could see traces of the boy he must have been, could imagine him growing up in this small town, learning his trade, becoming the steady, dependable man who had stepped forward to save her when no one else would. "You have to wake up," she told him quietly, her fingers tracing gentle patterns on the back of his hand. "There's so much I need to tell you, so much I should have said before." She had been thinking during these long hours of waiting, remembering conversations and moments from their week together, seeing them now with new clarity, the way he had looked at her during their vow renewal, the careful tenderness in his touch, the way he had spoken about building a life together. None of it had been performance. It had all been real, as real as the love she was only now allowing herself to acknowledge. "I love you?" she whispered, the words feeling both foreign and natural on her lips. "I don't know when it happened. Don't know how you managed to slip past all my defenses, but I love you. Ethan Graves. And if you don't wake up soon, I'm going to be very angry with you." As if summoned by her words, Ethan's eyelids fluttered. For a moment, Mary Beth thought she had imagined it, but then his eyes opened slowly, blinking against the gentle morning light. "Mary?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough from days of disuse. "I'm here." She leaned forward, her face coming into his line of sight. "I'm right here." Confusion clouded his features as he tried to orient himself. "Where? What happened?" "You're in Dr. Harrison's house. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Mary Beth reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, helping him take small sips. "You were hurt fighting those men. Do you remember?" Memory returned gradually. She could see it in his eyes. The burning cabin, the chase through Devil's Garden, the confrontation with Jonas Creed. "You're safe," he said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of profound relief. "You're all right. Because of you." Mary Beth set the glass aside and took his hand again. "You saved me, Ethan. You came for me when I thought no one would, when I thought I was going to die in that place. Couldn't lose you again," he said simply. "Couldn't let them take you away from me. You almost died." The words came out more harshly than she intended, edged with all the fear and anguish of the past 3 days. "You were burning with fever, talking out of your head, and I thought I was going to lose you before I ever got the chance to tell you." "Tell me what?" Mary Beth took a deep breath, summoning the courage that had carried her through gunfights and desperate escapes, but somehow deserted her when it came to matters of the heart. "That I love you. That what we have isn't pretense anymore. Hasn't been for days. That I want to build a real life with you. Not because I have to, but because I can't imagine living without you." Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment she feared she had misread everything, that her feelings weren't reciprocated after all. Then his free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Mary," he said, her name carrying more tenderness than she had ever heard in another human voice. "I've been waiting my whole life to hear you say that. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I was so afraid, so guarded. I'd been hurt so many times. Trusted the wrong people. And I thought, shh. His thumb traced across her lips, silencing her apologies. You don't need to explain. You don't need to apologize for protecting yourself. All that matters is now. All that matters is that we found our way to each other. Through the window, they could hear the sounds of Millbrook waking up, the lowing of cattle, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop that was temporarily without its owner, the cheerful chatter of children playing in the street. It was the sound of normal life, of community, of a place where they might finally be able to build something lasting. What happens now? Mary Beth asked. The cabin is gone. Your shop needs tending, and the whole town knows what happened. They'll have questions, want explanations. Let them ask, Ethan said, his voice growing stronger. We'll tell them the truth, that Jonas Creed was a wanted criminal who came looking for trouble and found more than he bargained for. That justice was served, and now it's over. And us? What do we tell them about us? Ethan's smile was soft and full of promise. We tell them that we're married, that we love each other, and that we're planning to build a life together in their town. If they don't like it, that's their problem, not ours. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation, and Dr. Harrison peered in, his face breaking into a broad smile when he saw Ethan awake and alert. Well, well, the doctor said, bustling into the room with his medical bag. It's about time you rejoined the land of the living. How are you feeling? Like I got trampled by a herd of cattle, Ethan admitted. But better, much better. I should think so, with such devoted nursing care. Dr. Harrison glanced meaningfully at Mary Beth, who blushed at the implication. This young woman hasn't left your side for 3 days. Quite remarkable, really. As the doctor checked Ethan's wounds and changed his bandages, word spread quickly through Millbrook that the blacksmith was awake and recovering. By afternoon, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the Harrison house, each bearing gifts of food, flowers, or simple well wishes. Mrs. Henderson came with a basket of fresh bread and jam, her manner noticeably warmer than it had been during their week of scrutiny. We've all been praying for your recovery, she told Ethan. The whole town has been worried sick. Jake Morrison stopped by with several other men from town, their hats in their hands and their expressions serious. We heard what you did, Jake said quietly. Taking on 3 armed men to save your wife, that took real courage. Even Judge Blackwood made an appearance, his usually stern demeanor softened by genuine concern. The territorial marshal will want a full report about Creed and his men, he told them. But from what I've heard, it was clearly self-defense. There won't be any charges. But it was the visit from young Timothy Walsh that touched Mary Beth most deeply. The shy 16-year-old appeared in the doorway, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers, his face red with embarrassment. I picked these for you, ma'am, he said, offering the flowers to Mary Beth. My ma said they'd brighten up the room, and I wanted to say I'm sorry for how some folks treated you when you first came back. It wasn't right. Thank you, Timothy, Mary Beth said, accepting the flowers with genuine warmth. That means more to me than you know. As evening approached and the last of the visitors departed, Mary Beth found herself alone with Ethan again. He was sitting up now, his color much improved, though she could see that the day's activities had tired him. You should rest, she said, straightening his pillows. Dr. Harrison says you need to take it easy for at least another week. Only if you promise to get some real sleep tonight. Ethan replied, Mrs. Harrison has made up the spare room for you. You can't keep sleeping in that chair. I don't want to leave you alone. I'll be fine for one night. He reached into the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out something small and glinting. Besides, I have something for you. Mary Beth stared at the object in his palm, a simple silver ring, clearly handmade, with a small turquoise stone set in the center. It was beautiful in its simplicity, exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself. Where did you get this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I made it, Ethan admitted, his cheeks coloring slightly. During our week together, when you were sleeping or working in the garden, I wanted to have something real to give you, something that wasn't part of the pretense. You made this for me. I started it the day after our wedding at the oak tree. I could see that you were beginning to trust me, beginning to let me in, and I wanted to be ready. I wanted to have something to offer you when you were ready to accept it. Mary Beth held out her left hand, her fingers trembling slightly. I'm ready now. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand specifically, which, she realized, it had been with this ring, he said solemnly. I thee wed, again, for real this time. For real this time, she agreed, leaning down to kiss him gently. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live. Outside, the sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing, calling the faithful to evening prayer. But for Mary Beth and Ethan, their prayers had already been answered. They had found each other in the wreckage of their past, had built something beautiful from the ashes of their mistakes. Now, with matching rings on their fingers and love in their hearts, they were ready to face whatever the future might bring. Together. 5 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the valley where the Open Hand Ranch spread out like a promise kept. From the porch of their new home, Mary Beth could see the cattle grazing peacefully in the east pasture, the vegetable garden that fed their growing household, and the cluster of small cabins that housed the children who had found their way to this place of second chances. The house itself was modest but solid, built with Ethan's careful hands and designed with Mary Beth's practical eye. It had wide porches to catch the evening breeze, large windows to let in the light, and enough bedrooms to accommodate the steady stream of orphaned and abandoned children who seemed to find their way to the ranch with increasing frequency. Mrs. Graves. Mrs. Graves. The excited voice belonged to Lucy Chen, a 7-year-old girl whose parents had died in a mining accident 2 counties over. She came running across the yard, her pigtails bouncing and her face bright with excitement. Come quick! Belle's had her foal! Mary Beth smiled and set aside the mending she'd been working on. Has she now? Well, we'd better go see this marvel. The barn was filled with golden morning light and the sweet smell of fresh hay. In the largest stall, a chestnut mare stood proudly beside her newborn foal, a leggy creature with the same warm coloring as its mother. Gathered around the stall were 5 other children, ranging in age from 4 to 14, all watching the baby horse with wonder and delight. Look how small he is, whispered Tommy Bradford, a 10-year-old whose father had been killed in a gunfight in Silver Creek. Do you think he knows how to walk yet? All horses know how to walk, declared Sarah Ann Webster, the oldest of their charges at 14 and possessed of the kind of worldly wisdom that came from having been on her own too long. It's instinct. Mary Beth leaned against the stall door, watching the children watch the foal. Each of these young souls had come to them broken in some way, orphaned by violence, abandoned by poverty, or simply unwanted by families who couldn't care for them. But here, surrounded by gentle animals and patient adults, they were learning to be children again. What should we name him? Asked little Benjamin Murphy, barely 4 years old and still shy about speaking up in groups. How about Sunrise? Suggested Lucy. Because he was born when the sun came up. That's a good name. Mary Beth agreed. But perhaps we should ask his mother what she thinks. The children giggled at this, and even serious Sarah Ann cracked a smile. These moments of simple joy were what made all the hard work worthwhile. The long days of cooking and cleaning and teaching. The nights spent comforting children who woke from nightmares. The constant worry about making ends meet on a ranch that was more refuge than business. Where's Mr. Graves? Tommy asked. He should see the baby horse too. He's in town with the marshal, Mary Beth replied. They should be back soon. What she didn't say was that Ethan had gone to meet with the territorial marshal about another child. a 9-year-old boy whose mother had been killed by her husband before the man turned the gun on himself. It was a story they heard too often, and each time it broke Mary Beth's heart a little more. The sound of horses approaching drew her attention, and through the barn door she could see 2 riders coming up the dusty road that led to their ranch. Ethan sat tall in the saddle of his black gelding, and beside him rode Marshal William Hayes, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement who had become something of a friend over the years. "Children," Mary Beth said gently, "why don't you go help Mrs. Patterson with the lunch preparations? I'll bet she could use some assistance peeling potatoes." The children scattered with good-natured grumbling, all except Sarah Ann, who lingered near the barn door with the kind of knowing look that suggested she understood exactly why the marshal had come calling. Ethan dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had learned to love horses as much as he had once loved working with iron and steel. The blacksmith shop still operated, but now it was run by his apprentice, young David Morrison, Jake Morrison's nephew, who had shown real talent for the trade. "How did it go?" Mary Beth asked, though Ethan's expression already told her most of what she needed to know. "The boy's name is Michael," Marshal Hayes said, climbing down from his horse with a grunt. "Michael Brennan. No relation to the gang," he added quickly. Seeing Mary Beth's startled expression, "Just an unfortunate coincidence." "How old?" she asked. 9, near as we can tell. He hasn't spoken since we found him. Doctor thinks it's the shock." Mary Beth nodded. They had dealt with traumatized children before, had learned patience and gentleness from a woman named Catherine Mills, who had come to help them the second year. Catherine had been a teacher back east before heading west to marry a man who turned out to be far different from his letters. When that arrangement failed, she had found her way to the Open Hand Ranch and had never left. "Where is he now?" Mary Beth asked. "In town with Catherine." Ethan replied, "She's getting him cleaned up and fed. They'll be along this afternoon." Marshal Hayes accepted the cup of coffee that Mrs. Patterson brought out from the kitchen, a robust woman in her 50s who served as cook, housekeeper, and surrogate grandmother to their collection of lost children. She had arrived the previous winter, her own grown children scattered to the 4 winds and her husband dead of consumption. Like so many others, she had found purpose at the ranch. "I have to ask," the marshal said after taking a grateful sip of the strong coffee. "Are you sure you can handle another one? You've got 6 children here already, plus all the work of running a ranch." Mary Beth exchanged a look with Ethan, one of those wordless conversations that long married couples perfected. They were stretched thin. It was true. Money was always tight, despite the modest income from their cattle and the small payments the territorial government made for each child they cared for. The work was exhausting, the responsibilities overwhelming, but then she thought of Tommy Bradford, who had arrived sullen and angry and was now teaching little Benjamin how to whittle. She thought of Lucy Chen, who had been so frightened when she first came that she wouldn't speak above a whisper, but now filled the house with laughter. She thought of Sarah Ann, who had been hardened by 2 years on the streets, but was now learning to trust again. "We'll make room," she said simply. "We always do," Ethan added, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. Marshal Hayes nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. "You two are doing something special here. The whole territory knows about the Open Hand Ranch. There are people in Austin talking about what you've built, thinking maybe it could be a model for other places." "We're just doing what needs doing," Mary Beth replied, but she felt a flush of pride at his words. When they had first started taking in children, it had been almost by accident. A little girl found wandering after an Apache raid, a boy whose parents had died of cholera, but word had spread, and children kept coming. The brand they used on their cattle reflected their philosophy, an open hand rather than a closed fist, a symbol of welcome and acceptance that had become known throughout the territory. Some people called them foolish idealists, but others saw them as something rarer, proof that decency and compassion could flourish even in the harsh realities of frontier life. After the marshal left, Mary Beth and Ethan walked together through their small domain, checking on the animals, inspecting the garden, making sure all was well in their carefully constructed world. It was a ritual they had developed over the years. These evening walks that allowed them to transition from the public business of running a ranch to the private pleasure of being husband and wife. "Tell me about the boy," Mary Beth said as they paused beside the corral where their horses grazed in the fading light. "Catherine says he's very thin. Probably hasn't been eating well since his mother died. He has bruises that are healing. Suggests his father was violent before the final tragedy." Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but Mary Beth could hear the anger underneath. Violence against children always affected him deeply, perhaps because of his own memories of standing by while others suffered. "How long since it happened?" 3 weeks. He's been living on the streets in Abilene, scrounging for food, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. A shopkeeper finally noticed him and called the law. Mary Beth leaned against the fence, watching their horses and thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this place. 5 years ago, she had been a woman with no future, no hope, no reason to believe that life could offer anything better than survival. Now she was the mother of 6 children who weren't born to her, the wife of a man who had taught her that love was possible even after betrayal, and the co-founder of something that people were calling a model for others to follow. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "All of this? We could have had a quiet life. Just the 2 of us. We could have rebuilt that cabin, lived simply, maybe had children of our own." Ethan turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious in the twilight. "Do you regret it?" "No," she said without hesitation. "Never. But sometimes I wonder if you do. You didn't sign up for all of this when you claimed me as your wife." "Mary Beth." He moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face in the gesture that still made her heart skip after 5 years of marriage. "I signed up for you. Everything else, the children, the ranch, this life we've built, it's all just been the natural result of who you are. You couldn't turn away from a child in need any more than you could stop breathing." "We couldn't," she corrected. "This is what we do together." "Together," he agreed, and leaned down to kiss her as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. That night, as they lay in their bed listening to the peaceful sounds of their household settling down for sleep, Mary Beth thought about the boy who would arrive tomorrow, Michael Brennan, 9 years old and silent with trauma, who would become the 7th child to find refuge at the Open Hand Ranch. "What do you think his story will be?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his arm tightening around her. "But I know how it will end." "How?" "The same way all their stories end here, with love, with healing, with the chance to become whoever they're meant to be." Outside their window, the wind carried the sound of cattle lowing softly in the distance and the rustle of leaves in the cottonwood trees they had planted their first spring, somewhere in the house. One of the children coughed gently in their sleep, and Mrs. Patterson's rocking chair creaked as she did her evening mending by lamplight. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life built on the radical notion that everyone deserved a second chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that love was stronger than loss, that hope was more powerful than despair. But tonight, Mary Beth Graves fell asleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the children they had claimed and the life they had chosen, knowing that sometimes the best things grew in the most unlikely places, like love blooming in the shadow of a hanging tree, like a ranch built on the ashes of a burned cabin, like a family forged from the fragments of broken lives. The Open Hand Ranch stood as a testament to the truth that Ethan had spoken beneath the oak tree so many years ago. Everyone deserved a second chance, even children who had lost everything, even women who had made terrible mistakes, even blacksmiths who had learned to be brave,